Let's look at a map. This is an 1800s Mercator projection, the visual standard that shaped how generations of students understood global geography. But its math distorts reality. If we correct the scale, the African continent is large enough to hold the landmasses of the United States, China, India, and all of Western Europe. They lock into place with room to spare. This geographic minimization reflects a parallel pattern of historical neglect in Western academic discourse. When a void exists in historical knowledge, those holding power rarely leave it empty. They fill it with manufactured narratives. In 1754, philosopher David Hume wrote he suspected Black people to be naturally inferior, claiming there were no arts, no sciences among them. These claims served a distinct economic purpose. Framing a continent as uncivilized provided the moral cover needed for the transatlantic slave trade and colonial expansion. This framing survived into the modern era. As late as 1962, Oxford history professor Hugh Trevor Roper declared that there was no African history, only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest, he insisted, was darkness. The idea of a historyless continent was never an accidental blind spot. It was an engineered architecture designed to justify white supremacy. While the formal systems of slavery and colonial rule ended, their intellectual frameworks remained embedded in cultural norms. We hear the echoes of Hume and Trevor Roper today when political and corporate leaders dismiss African nations' developmental capabilities using derogatory or dismissive language. Words like primitive or tribal are rarely used as objective anthropological descriptions. They are weaponized labels applied selectively to enforce a perceived global hierarchy. When modern commentators rely on this vocabulary to explain inequality, they are simply reading from a 300-year-old colonial script. The physical evidence tells a different story. Complex urban planning and architectural engineering extended far beyond the familiar Nile Valley. Deep in the Sahara of Niger, the ruins of Jado reveal an intricate network of fortified stone and mud brick settlements. In southern Africa, the walls of Great Zimbabwe reach up to 36 feet high, precision engineered without the use of mortar. In the Ethiopian highlands, monolithic structures like the Church of St. George were carved downward into solid volcanic rock. And in Sudan, Kushite civilizations commissioned hundreds of steep-sided stone pyramids as royal tombs. This 1914 political map shows how European powers approached these existing civilizations. They simply drew over them. Foreign powers sitting at conference tables in Europe partitioned the continent, carving arbitrary lines through centuries of existing linguistic and political organization. With the exception of Ethiopia, almost every modern African nation is a colonial construct, a fiction imposed over a deeply rooted historical reality. Because these colonial states were built for resource extraction rather than governance, they left a legacy of structural instability that modern African governments still navigate. This map illustrates the organic reality of the continent, vast language families and trade networks that existed long before the colonial partition. These cultural traditions refused to be contained by artificial borders. They continued to flow across and out of the continent. This flow created the Africana world, extending African history to a vast global diaspora across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. In places like Bahia, Brazil, traditional social structures and religious concepts adapted and survived, fundamentally reshaping the local landscape. This is the principle of cultural continuity, the reality that African traditions did not vanish under slavery or colonial rule. They survived to reshape the global cultural landscape. Studying African history is an act of unlearning, a deliberate dismantling of manufactured myths. The reality is a landscape defined by innovation and the scale of the modern African metropolis. We cannot accurately understand the origins of human innovation until we discard the frameworks designed to obscure it. To find that starting point, we must go back to the very beginning. In our next chapter, we travel to the Rift Valley to examine the first toolmakers and the initial migrations out of Africa. Subscribe and join us as we uncover the true story of human origins.